Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth webinar in our Database Lifecycle Management Coffee Break webinar series. Really excited to have two authors of the Database Lifecycle Management book here with us today to be talking about embracing DLM and give us more information about what Database Lifecycle Management is. So today we're going to be talking about the definitive guide to database lifecycle management, covering topics around DLM. We'll start off with introductions to our two panelists, who are the authors of the book, Grant Fritchey and Matthew Skelton. We'll then go into a panel discussion, and we really wanted to encourage you to ask questions throughout this discussion. So you should have a panel in your GoToWebinar pane where you can ask questions. Just feel free to type in questions at any time, and hopefully we can get to them during the discussion. We'll also save some time at the end for Q&A, and we can follow up with any questions afterwards as well. So we really want to make this an interactive webinar. We want to answer your questions, so please feel free to ask them throughout. And then at the end, we'll also have a 5-minute talk more about the Database Lifecycle Management book that the two authors are writing, and learn more about that. This webinar is being recorded, so there will be an option to view the recording afterwards. We'll send a link around, and we'll go ahead and get started. So first, I'd like to introduce Matthew Skelton. Matthew, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. I work for a company called Skelton Consulting, and we help organizations to get to grips with modern software delivery and operations techniques like continuous delivery, like DevOps, software operability, this kind of thing. We've been working with Redgate for several months now on these kind of areas. So it's exciting to be part of this webinar today. It's exciting to be writing a book with Grant. My background originally was in software development, so I've been developing software largely on the Windows platform, but not entirely, also on Linux and more recently cloud platforms too. Since I started back in 1998 was where I got first involved commercially. And I've done everything from kind of embedded systems through desktop, early web systems, and more recently more cloud-based systems. And increasingly I've been involved in build and deployment and infrastructure as well.
Great. It's great to have you here today. And Grant, could you give an introduction for yourself?
Sure thing. My name is Grant Fritchey. I work for Redgate Software. I've been the Product Evangelist there for years. I'm very excited about the whole database lifecycle management topic because I spent years at my previous employer figuring out how to automate database deployments, doing some of it very successfully, some of it doing it not so successfully. And back then it was a very manual process, required lots and lots of labor and work and pain, and today I won't say it's easy, but it's infinitely easier than it used to be, and so it's just a really wonderful topic. I'm very excited to be able to share this with Matthew. We've had a lot of discussions over the topics, and he's become one of my favorite developers, I swear. The man knows what he's talking about. This is really awesome. So it's going to be a great, great book, and this is just a wonderful topic. So I mean, I just can't help but get quite excited about it.
Yeah, it's great pairing someone with a really strong database background and someone with a really strong development background, because really, you know, DLM is more than just the database. So that actually leads us into our discussion around the definitive guide to database lifecycle management. And what is DLM? Can you guys give an explanation for our audience?
Yeah, of course. So the name database lifecycle management reflects the more familiar term that many people will have heard before, which is application lifecycle management, in which we think about as the name suggests, the life cycle of the software application from concept through to build, deployment, run, improvements, and eventually retirement. And so we've taken, DLM, Database Lifecycle Management, takes some of the same kind of sort of framework and approach, but adds and modifies, adds some extra things and modifies some of those, some of the focuses to take account of databases and crucially data, because the tricky thing with databases is that they contain data. That's probably the most tricky thing. We have to keep that data around. That is the point of databases. Whereas if you think about when you deploy applications, you can wipe the server clean, or you can spin up an entirely new server, deploy the application on top of it. We can't blow away the database. We just can't do that. So that's why DLM has some additional things, not the same as ALM, Application Lifecycle Management. It has some additional things that we need to think about, because we've got to retain the data there, and because that's absolutely crucial to the lifeblood of a company, or to the success of that company. So there's some additional considerations that we need for when we're thinking about delivering changes to databases over and above what we get with an application.
Grant, anything to add there? Or?
Wow, that was pretty complete. I mean, the thing is, it's you really have to think about the fact that every application is it's, you know, the term that was used to me by someone, and it was a dismissive term, but I've actually adopted it and taken it, is the applications persist, right? They have a persistence layer, and that persistence layer is the database. And so if you think about application lifecycle management and your ability to move things through from development through some sort of testing, automated or not, into a production environment, automated or not, and ignoring the database because, you know, it's just a persistence layer is kind of crazy, because, I mean, the persistence layer is going to be there no matter what. And the fact is, because of the persistence layer, and I actually like this, I like actually taking that and owning it. We persist. We're going to stick around. We can't, you know, just be replaced. Code, you know, deploying code is not easy, don't get me wrong. It's a very difficult process, but you can simply replace it. You throw the old version out, you put the new version in. We can't really do that with databases because we persist. And so you must take into account the whole concept of database lifecycle management along with your application lifecycle management, or you're just going to inflict pain upon yourself. And so, you know, I mean, that's my big thing is you know, it's not separate from application lifecycle management. It's a part of it. We're just calling it out and differentiating it because of the additional problems that it exposes, not because it's actually something separate. It's completely a part of ALM. It's just, you know, you have a need to persist data. You can't get away from that. And so, you know, let's assume that, and then start thinking DLM as a part of ALM, and then life is a lot easier.
So we wanted to discuss how broad DLM is, and I know, Matthew, you mentioned originally it's not just the database, it's also the data. But what else does DLM entail?
So because when we think about making changes to databases that are more automated, more frequent, more rapid, but still safe, then because we're touching these systems which are really crucial for the operational and financial success of these organizations that we work with, then DLM starts to touch a much wider number of things than we might first expect. So, for example, particularly if the organization that we're talking about is in, say, the financial services sector, or in healthcare, or in any regulated sector, perhaps taking credit card payments, so kind of PCI compliance, that kind of thing, then as soon as we start touching the database, then that has an impact on audit and traceability and compliance with these external regulations. So we have to, as we're thinking about making these changes more automated and more rapid and more safe, we have to think about requirements like auditability and traceability, compliance. Otherwise, any changes we try and put in place are going to hit a brick wall, which is the compliance officer saying, sorry, you can't do that because you're not giving me the traceability that I need. So that's one area which it immediately touches, but it kind of touches other things too. We need to think about how our infrastructure is set up and configured to make sure, for example, that all our different, all the database servers in different environments are configured consistently, ideally from a set of configuration scripts or a set of configuration files that are stored in version control. Because if our database servers or database environments are not consistent and we don't know how they are configured, how can we be sure that the testing that we're doing as we're moving these changes down through the different environments, how can we be sure that that any faults that come out of that testing, any errors that we find, how can we be sure they're not just related to some misconfiguration? So we need to be thinking about version control too. We need to think about infrastructure configuration. We need to touch on how we make things testable. How we go about testing stuff. It's not just a case of ripping through a whole lot of manual steps in some big Word document or spreadsheet. We need to design things. We need to design our systems, our environments to make them testable in the first place. So we go back to the drawing board. We have conversations with people who have got a QA hat on or a tester hat on, and we get their input to try and understand how to make part of our release process more testable. These are just a few things mentioned. I'm sure Grant will come up with some more, but you start to see that it's actually important that we bring in people and processes and practices that sit certainly outside of the DBA team, but also outside of DBA or development as well. It does go a little bit further than that, because data is so important. That's the reason it starts to touch different people outside of our smaller teams.
Absolutely, and then you go into, you start thinking about the other additional stuff that you have on top of that, right? So you have ETL processes that are part of your database, but not really part of your database development process, because you're not developing, a new ETL process, you're developing new functionality inside your app. So you get very focused on ensuring, that your app is working, that you've got the persistence layer set up right, that you're able to deploy this, you've automated the testing, you've automated deployment, out it goes, everything's awesome. And then the alerts come in because the ETL process that night broke because you've made changes. Oops. Okay, so now we've got to get the ETL team involved to make sure that they're ready. And hey, guess what? That's going over to the data warehouse. The data warehouse team has got to be involved as well because you're making structural changes that expand past just your own stuff. It's moving into other teams and other applications. You've got downstream applications that may be dependent upon your data. So you split this table up into two new parts to support more additional functionality. Oh darn, you just broke a service that three quarters of the company is dependent upon. I mean, it grows so fast and so far. Application and application code can sometimes be isolated, not always. Data can sometimes be isolated, not always. But when either of these things is not isolated, then it expands out rapidly, and you see all these other teams involved. Then you bring in other things like, well, okay, so we're going to set up this lifecycle management practice. Awesome. Well, what do we need? We're going to need some place to do chats. So now you've got to bring in additional software, additional maintenance overhead. The server team's got to be brought in. I mean, the concept of application lifecycle management, and it's kind of funny because I prefer the term DevOps, and a lot of people think of ALM and DevOps as the same thing, but to a degree ALM is a little more isolated than DevOps, but you can think of them both in the same way. They expand rapidly. Whoops, everything went away. Webcam's disappeared. Maybe it's just me. Okay, sorry. I'll keep talking.
Okay. Sounds like you're back now.
That was odd. But the thing is that it expands so rapidly, and it's not just about your operations or your dev team or your DBAs. Every bit of this stuff that we're doing, applications especially, but data especially too, impacts business, and that means you've got to bring your business teams in. So the concept of ALM or DLM being isolated or being a little tiny pipeline that you don't need to talk to anybody, it's crazy. I mean, this is big stuff. It's not minor. So you really kind of it's kind of weird, I mean, 10 years ago when I started trying this process, the technology was impossibly difficult. Now, the technology is easy-ish, and the process is still every bit as hard as it was 10 years ago, and it's because of how broad this topic gets, and it really does get broad quickly.
I think that's a really good point, and I think Graham's picked up there two things there are at least two things which are driving the need for DLM, and Graham picked them up there. One of them is that we have new technology. So if you think 10 years ago, then server virtualization was available but not very advanced, whereas now we've got you can spin up an entire cloud environment in Azure or AWS or Rackspace or wherever, in minutes. And that's a fundamental step change in our capabilities that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago. And there's new tooling that goes along with it, things like Vagrant for VM testing, things like Packer for creating VM images, all sorts of amazing new tools, even things like Git for version control, which are in my view, far superior to the previous version control systems, are massive enablers for new ways of doing things. So there's all the tooling there and the technology which has changed. And part of the thing that has done is to remove infrastructure as a blocker for rapid change. So 10, 15 years ago, infrastructure took a long time to provision. We had to raise a change that may have resulted in a really expensive change request going through. It may have taken weeks or months to provision a new database server. Now we can spin that stuff up really, really quickly, and it's a lot. We can do it in ways which can be a lot cheaper. So that's one side, is a kind of infrastructure and technology changes. On the other side, though, we've got a greater awareness of tech leaks from lean manufacturing or lean practices in general, where we're encouraged to consider the activities of the organization as a whole, end to end, with everyone involved, rather than chopping things into small functional silos where people do one little bit of work and then pass it on. So, and because some of these organizations who have adopted lean practices are really flying, going really, really quickly and doing amazingly well, that's bound to make other organizations kind of sit up and stare and say, well, we want some of that too. And that's another reason why if we're talking about making changes to our databases much more frequent and regular but safe, then if we start to think in this more joined up way with more and more kind of a more end-to-end way of thinking, so we're thinking about a flow of value, then it's not surprising that more people are involved, simply because we're kind of stretching out to the sphere of who's involved in the delivery and thinking about delivery of these changes. So that's another reason why we expect something like DLM to have a focus on stuff that's not just at the database and technology level, but also processes, practices, things like security, compliance, reporting, all sorts of other stuff too.
We have a question from Craig about automated builds based on projects, not on how one server is different than another. So how do you move projects from dev to UA to integration to production, project by project?
Well, it's going to depend what project is. That project means a million different things to a million different people.
And that's a pretty drilled down specific type of question. I mean, the real answer there is going to be that you need to have a mechanism in place for tracking the changes within that project. Obviously, that mechanism is going to be source control I mean, there are some other ways to do it, but basically, you've got to have a way to say version A of the project looks like this, version B of the project looks like that, and you've got to have, you know, a mechanism in place that can migrate from version A to version B, and that gets into tooling. I mean, I'm more than happy to start talking tooling, but I mean that's really detailed over some of the stuff that we've been talking about so far. Matthew, you want to add something to that, or Stephanie, should we start talking about tools?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add at this stage to that question is, I mean, maybe we'll come back to it later and talk, if we can wrap up some other questions and talk about some tooling and that kind of thing. I think that's a good idea. The only thing I'd add at this stage is that it's really important in the context of continuous delivery, in the context of DLM, to make changes small and meaningful, and if possible, do them one after the other rather than in parallel. So rather than a load of changes happening in parallel, let's do one change at a time and then follow it with another change. Because if we serialize our changes one at a time, if we serialize the changes, it's much easier to be able to undo them or back them out or identify when a particular thing has caused a problem. If we have many changes going through the system at the same time, it becomes much harder to distinguish what's caused a particular problem. So maybe that partly answers the question there. It might give a hint about the size of change that you're trying to flow down the pipeline toward production.
Something you guys were talking about earlier, just about how many people this involves and how many teams, like how would somebody get started with this? It just sounds a little overwhelming. Any ideas on getting started
and who to talk to first? Or? The short answer I've got is that you, I mean, and I use this comparison a lot, but I can't help it because it just makes sense. It's eating an elephant, right? It's one bite at a time. You can't build a DLM process, right? You need to establish a whole bunch of foundational stuff in order to be able to build a DML process. So, for example, Craig here's got his databases already in source control. That's, you know, step one. Great. But now there's about 1 million additional steps. So he's saying like, okay, well, great. I've got this mechanism. I know that I know which changes have been made, but how do I determine where these changes are? And if I run, and he brought up a tool, SQL Compare, it's going to create this script, but the script is untested. And so the trick is to start automating processes around generating that script and testing that script, and then assuming that script passed your tests, retaining it, and versioning it and labeling it, and that becomes your initial mechanism. Because now you know, okay, for this script it will get me from A to B. Well, let me apply that to QA. QA's on A, right? Yeah, we'll apply it. Oh, cool, it worked. Awesome, we pulled that out of source control, we applied it. Now we know that script will move from A to B successfully. Excellent. Well, production's on A. Let's try it on production. Hey, cool. It worked on production. We're off. We're running. Yeehaw. And so it's just these small incremental steps, one at a time, over and over again, automating. And if your byword and watchword isn't automation, you're going to be in pain. You've got to automate every step of the process, and then it's just building it out one at a time. You know, setting up the mechanisms for creating a virtual machine so that you can, you know, simulate environments quickly and easily. Setting up the mechanism for automating virtual machines so you can set up these environments quickly and easily. It's a series of steps. And lastly, and because I know Matthew's probably going to jump all over this one too, you also need to make sure that in addition to tooling and processes, that you're looking at internal business structures and processes, because this is not strictly a technology problem. It is also a business-oriented problem to make sure that you're setting things up in such a way that you can support your business, but also that your business knows what you're doing and how you're doing it, because the whole thing about this kind of process is that you can circumvent it all and just completely short-circuit and ignore it, and you'll pay for that. So you need to be careful about building these things out.
I think that's a really good point from Grant. So what's behind that is the need for visibility and surfacing what we're doing. We can. I think there's a question here about sharing some of our favorite tools. So we can look at that a little bit later. But one of the tools that I found to be a real enabler for teams in lots of different organizations that we worked with is a big TV screen, huge. In fact, it's bigger than I can show you in the video here because it stretches off. It's about this wide. Huge, like 1-2 meter screen, or what's that, 4-6 feet screen that you can put on the wall. Have several of these around the office as an information radiator or as a kind of dashboard, and bring together information, state, and kind of the state of the world, what's happening. So we can bring together information from what we're doing in development, but also stuff from what's happening in the QA environment, but also bring in some stats or some metrics from live. Let's see it together. Let's see what's happening in all of these different stages of development and operation. Bring them together. Let's make ourselves aware of what's happening, but also we can set up a dashboard like that so that it's very easy and friendly to be able to show to someone who's less technical, someone who is, let's say, from the business, or a budget holder or product manager or program manager. So it's very easy for them to even just walk past the area where we're working in, for them to look at the monitor and immediately get a sense of what's happening. They don't even need to ask anyone. That's a massive enabler for organizations. If we can focus enough on metrics and measurements, measure the right things, not get hung up on meeting arbitrary or semi-arbitrary measurements and targets for delivery, but measure things which are really useful, display them, be honest about what's happening. If something's going wrong, let's be honest about it. Let's put it there, rate that as amber or rate it as red if it's really hurting. Let's be honest about about the actual state of the world. But it does mean that then we're able to we have data to talk about what's happening, and we can start to reason why perhaps things are going wrong or why things are taking longer. That is, if you can get that kind of culture right for this kind of thing, it's a huge enabler for progress and to be able to go more quickly. So that'd be the first thing I'd say on that. The second thing I want to say is that if you can see it like this, as we bring practices which are familiar to software developers, as we bring these in and kind of and expand these down towards production. So things like version control. So version control traditionally perhaps people just use for source code for applications. Increasingly we need to use it for things like database store procedures, database schemas, database reference data, configuration for servers, all sorts of things like this. And we want to, so basically we're kind of using tools that were traditionally development tools further and further towards production. But equally we can use tools which perhaps traditionally have only been used in production, and bring these further and further up, back up the stream, if you like, towards development. So things like server monitoring, metrics, log aggregation, these kind of things which traditionally were just operations type tools. Why do we not bring those up into test environments, UAT, development environments, so that we can share experience about how to use these tools? We can prove that a change we're about to make in development is not going to adversely affect our logging in production. And we get to know about that change much sooner because we're doing it upstream. And likewise, things like detection of configuration drift, or detection of drift in general. So drift where the state of one thing has moved from what we expect. So that could be a database. The database in production has changed from the state we expected to be in based on what we had last in pre-production, or it could be the state of configuration in one environment is different from what we expect. Now that kind of drift detection thing, traditionally perhaps been quite a production-focused thing. There's absolutely every reason why we can use that same kind of technology in upstream environments too. So in our test environment, our dev environment. So here's one specific tool which I absolutely love. It's called Guardrail, and it's from a company called ScriptRock. And you drop the Guardrail agent on your server. It will start monitoring stuff straight away, and it will give you a nice report. which you can then send alerts through and all sorts of stuff, but not just for the production environment, for the upstream environments too, so that we get familiar with using tools like this and helping us to build a better system as a whole, so that we're not just focusing on a tiny bit of application or a tiny bit of database. We're focusing on how the whole system works as a whole. That includes logging, metrics, monitoring, database application, servers, performance, security, all of that stuff. But we're not treating production as somehow special. We're bringing some of that opsy stuff back up into development, just as some of the development tools are heading towards the opsy world.
Sounds like you're just trying to remove, not having any surprises when you do that final deployment to production, and things are different there.
Avoiding surprises. You could say that DLM, at least a big component of DLM, is avoiding surprises, and that would be a nice way of summarizing it in 2 words. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, if the first time you're running a script is production, you're doing it wrong. Period. I mean, just flat out.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about DLM and ALM before, but we hear a lot about continuous delivery. We hear a lot about DevOps, Agile. How does DLM relate to those other processes as well?
I already brought up DevOps already, but I mean, it's a part of those. I mean, this whole Agile process. How to put this? The concept of speeding up delivery of software, the mechanisms that developers have spent the last couple of decades figuring out to try to improve the quality of their software and deliver it faster, they're actually wonderful, right? They are fantastic processes. There's been a lot of great minds, put to hard work to figure out how to do Agile, how to do it properly. I mean, because you can sure screw it up. But been there, done that. But there's nothing in DLM that divorces it from an Agile process, right? You're going to have a short sprint. Cool. That means there's only going to be a few changes. Awesome. We can hook right into this daily stand-up so we know what changed. Excellent. You know what I mean? You get these little 5-minute meetings. We understand what's going on. We can tell you what changes we've made. Oh my gosh, you're going to make a change to this. That impacts this table, right? Okay, great. Everybody's on board. We'll add another test. You know what I mean? There is no, again, if you've got a persistence layer, and I don't care what the persistence layer is, if it's a NoSQL database, that's awesome, right? DocumentDB is cool. It's not about any particular technology. It's about the fact that you've got to persist the information for your business. And so you're using an Agile process to make your development work. Great. Incorporate your database team into that Agile process, and the database team incorporate the Agile processes into what you do. Speaking of Agile, speaking of these processes, and particularly on DevOps, another thing that Matt brought up is this whole idea of moving production down. One aspect of that gets missed a lot because people get very focused on dev. Bug fixes have to be a part of this. It can't be, oh, we've got this deployment process, and then over here someplace there's this bug fix thing that we do. It's got to be plugged right in. The bug fix process and the deployment process are not different. They are completely a constant aspect of the same deployment and development process, the same Agile, the same DevOps mindset, the same DevOps acceptability gets plugged right back into your bug fixes. So I mean, it's that whole thing, moving production down, moving development up. It's not fighting with each other, and it's not one taking over the other. It is about an integration in order to speed things up.
It's a really good point from Grant there. So certainly in my experience, that single case of how do you actually roll out a bug fix is really indicative of an organization's approach to approach and kind of maturity, if you like, with software delivery and so on. Because if we have one procedure for releasing things that maybe takes a long time and that has certain kind of testing in there, but then a separate procedure for bug fixes, often the bug fix procedure will be it'll need to happen very quickly because there's a problem in production. So then the less testing is done because we want to get it out quickly, but then it's a bug in production. And if we're going to do less testing when there's a problem in production, that seems to my mind crazy. That's the time when we actually want to have a really good amount of testing because there's already a problem there. So if we put something into production that's less tested when there's a problem, are we not going to make it worse? Almost certainly we are. So that one thing there about, what do you have a different, does your software release process allow you to release a bug within, say, 5 minutes or 10 minutes? That's a really crucial thing to get to, and that should help to drive the kind of practices and activities that you put in place between committing a new change in your database script or in your application and that appearing in production. So in the DLM context, we're thinking about these additional things like security, like compliance, like data integrity, and so the kind of checks we have before we release a new bug fix will include some of those things too, which perhaps they might not have included if we were just thinking about the application code independently. But yeah, getting a single release mechanism which is fast enough for both kind of expected changes and unexpected changes is really crucial. For me, continuous delivery is, I've seen it's misunderstood. Some people think continuous delivery means we're always pushing things into production all the time. It's not that. Let's be really, really clear. Continuous delivery is a set of practices which help us to improve the quality and speed and reliability and safety of our software delivery. And that software delivery could be to a website, web system. It could be to an internal system. We might be writing software which we burn to a DVD and ship to a customer. There's plenty of software still written like that. It might be software for embedded systems. So Hewlett-Packard did a load of really, really outstanding work on effectively what is continuous delivery for their embedded software for printers. And they vastly improved the quality of their embedded software for their printers. This is going back to about 2010. And in effect, they're doing something which looks a lot like continuous delivery, but they were not clearly with embedded software, with printer firmware. You can't push that out into into production as soon as it's ready because the printer's already in someone's office. You can't do a firmware update. But the practices that they put in place were focused on quality, were focused on doing on repeatability, on traceability. And that helped them to be able to vastly improve the quality of the software they're producing. So continuous delivery is applicable to a huge wide range of different software development contexts. And part of the reason it works is because we are making changes often, we're integrating often, daily, and many more times during the day. Is we're not waiting for weeks and weeks to integrate code from different developers and from different places. We're testing continuously. We have the ability to release our code at any time. We don't have to do a special build or pull together have some special kind of process to do a build that allows us to release. We have automatic practices in place which build the code and test it and make it available for release if that's the right thing to do at the time. So that's the crucial thing about the biggest difference between continuous deployment and continuous delivery. Continuous delivery gives us the option to release something if it's appropriate. Continuous deployment, which works for some people, kind of the kind of thing that Facebook and Netflix and so on do, they have quite a special situation where they're able to push as soon as that stuff is ready. And that's fine for them, that works, but we're not talking about automatically pushing, we're talking about pulling a new version through the pipeline when we need it. So let's be absolutely clear what we mean by continuous delivery there.
Well, and
yeah.
Facebook doesn't develop on production. I mean, they used to, but they don't now. They can't afford the downtime any more than anyone else does. They've got testing mechanisms in place too.
Yep, sure. So if you think about the term DevOps, DevOps, certainly my experience is the sweet spot for DevOps is in big web scale systems. Again, if you think about a company like Hewlett-Packard writing embedded firmware for printers, they don't need DevOps because there's no operations team to help operate the printers that are on someone's desk. Whereas with a big e-commerce website or travel booking, holiday booking, for example, or some other kind of system which is these days probably in the cloud or at least in a data center and can be accessed by many thousands or millions of people, that's where DevOps comes in. So there are definitely aspects of of the practices that have come out of DevOps which have been proven to work really, really well. So particularly sharing of data, sharing of experience, sharing of responsibility between teams. We think about metrics and monitoring, the importance of being able to monitor something, the importance of pulling that data out and making it visible and being able to do some analysis on it is really crucial. Automation as another component of DevOps, again, absolutely crucial for DLM. Without the ability to automate a lot of these changes, we're simply not going to get the changes done as quickly as we need. We've talked about lean already as a key thing that's driving some of this kind of DLM change, and also DevOps focuses on the cultural changes that are needed to make this stuff happen, and that's also one of the things that DLM looks at, is what kind of team responsibility changes do we need to make? What kind of where's the boundary of responsibility? Who's responsible for what? These things can have a major effect on how well an organization is going to be able to do things much more quickly, make changes much more quickly. If we don't have the team motivations and responsibilities and boundaries right, it's going to be really hard to do some of this stuff. So that's why DLM also, as part of its remit, looks at kind of organization, structure, team responsibilities, culture, this kind of thing.
So something you guys were talking about earlier, and having, bug fixes have to be part of this process, and you need to be able to, test them and get them out, and, that risk of making a change directly to production versus, getting production fixed as soon as possible. Because we're talking about databases, someone brought up a really good question about, dev data versus production data. And we talked before about having, all the environments being the same to avoid surprises. So can you give us some thoughts around, dev data versus production data and how that works in DLM?
Well, I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a DLM process necessarily. I mean, obviously it has to be incorporated into your DLM process. Get that right. It's just that it's not something special that DLM is bringing to the table, because the concept of well, we need production data to do development is ancient. It's always been that way. The problem that we face today is, and Matthew's already brought this up, there's a lot of regulatory stuff that says no, you can't, right? You cannot have legally, and I'm talking punishable by prison, you cannot have patient information in your development environment. Period. It's not a discussion point, it's a law. It is a legal, you will go to jail law. I'm not going to go to jail to help my dev team. I love my dev team. I just don't love them that much, right? I'm not going to prison for them. So they don't get production data. They're going to get a copy of production that has been cleansed. They may get a subset of production data. I mean, I'm going to have to set up something within my development processes, within my DLM processes, that creates a database that they can test on, right? We're going to have some mechanism for them to look at, to look at data that simulates production, but they just can't have production data. They can't. Legally, I'll go to prison, and that is not happening, so therefore you're not getting production data. I mean, it's just that simple.
For me, this is actually not a bad thing. This is going to be a bit contentious now, so some people might not like what I'm going to say, but I'll say it anyway. What I've seen is that I've seen teams think, oh, we need the data from production, otherwise we can't do anything. What I have seen is that part of the reason they want the production data is because they don't want to think too carefully about the nature of how that system actually works. So getting a copy of production just kind of means that they don't really have to think so much about what the data's doing. They don't have to think about, for example, under what circumstances will this particular query run slow? Is it purely the volume of data? Do we actually definitely need 1 terabyte of data in the database? Or actually, is it will that query run slow when we simply have 10,000 items in the reference data table? So if we can't use production, there's an opportunity for us to actually start to think a bit more carefully, a bit more specifically about the kind of performance and data relationship problems that can occur within our databases, within our application. And that allows us then, if we've isolated one particular performance problem to, let's say we need at least 10,000 locations in a location reference table, something like this, then that's great, because then we can actually create that data table up front. We can have a specific test case for it, and it means we don't need the production data. And we keep iterating around this loop, being more and more specific about the kind of test cases we actually need to put in place, to the point where perhaps there will be 1 or 2 things that 1 or 2 problems or bugs that still arise because we've never seen production data before. But hopefully that's right down to a really, really small number of things, because we've been forced, in effect, or we've had to take the time to think much more carefully about the conditions under which our application will behave strangely based on different kinds of data. So I think actually it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, because we're actually making our testing much better. We've got a better understanding of the software application as a whole, and we've improved the quality. So for me that has to be a good thing, even though it's a bit more painful.
Yeah, and it is more painful. I won't lie. It creates a lot of work for the DBA team to try to create some kind of simulated data set and then maintain that over time. It's a pain in the butt.
There are some organizations whose production data set is so huge that there's no way they can replicate it in upstream environments anyway. So there's I know of in the UK there's a music that they provide a music management API, and the amount of data they have videos and music from across the world, just terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data. There's no way they can take a copy of that and put it on a developer's machine. The developers have to come up with tests which are realistic, which reduce the risk of things going wrong without all of that data, because there's no way it's going to fit on any laptop hard disk ever, SSD, right. Whatever. It's just not going to happen. So that you have to, and that problem's only going to get worse with things like big data and with big Hadoop processing clusters and things like this. We have to find ways to reason about how our application is going to behave with much smaller data sets, because we are not going to be able to get a copy of production and put it on our developer laptop. Ain't going to happen. Not in the future. I
agree.
So we're running short on time, and there was a question earlier about, can you recommend one of your favorite tools for DLM? Matthew, I know you were talking about Guardrail earlier, but any other things for people to take away and go look at?
Yeah, there's one particular tool which I was super excited to see this when I first saw it. It's a tool that's been developed by Redgate, and it's called DLM Dashboard. I talked about it in a conference talk I gave at QCon London earlier this year, and I talked about it because I was so excited to see it. it allows teams to detect database drift. So if one database from one environment has drifted from the state, a recognized state in another environment, you can send an alert. And the reason I like it, so there's a free version you can download from the Redgate website, but the reason I like it is because it provides, not only does it deal with tracking kind of database drift and so on, and allowing alerts and things, but in effect it brings together the development team and the DBA team. In effect, it starts to be a kind of communication tool, a way of bridging what in the past has been a bit of a gap. So when I saw it, what I saw immediately was, this is amazing. This is a cultural enabler. This is something which can really start to bridge that gap between historically different teams and start to produce a dialogue. So I was super excited to see that tool.
And Grant, a takeaway from you?
Tools?
Tools or?
I mean, I'm going to say bluntly, yeah, buy every Redgate tool that's made.
Well, you work for Redgate, so.
But I work for Redgate, so I'm going to try to talk about something else. I would, if you're not exploring Git right now, you should. That is really one of the more fascinating. It's not simply source control. I mean, it does source control, it does it well. It's a change in how you need to think about your development and deployment processes, because it focuses on the merge as the fundamental aspect, not simply the change. It affects the way you do things. The branch is how it works, not some additional thing glued on the side. It really is a fascinating piece of software, and I think most people would benefit from it, but you actually need to think about how to use it properly. So that's the one I would recommend everyone take a look at. Git and GitHub. Thank you, Brian. It's absolutely a place to get in there and start looking at stuff, because it's just, it's going to change the way you work. And so, I mean, that's the one I would recommend. I mean, there's a whole bunch of others. I mean, TeamCity's awesome. Jenkins, there's a bunch of other ones out there. I mean, it's all cool stuff. Octopus, take a look at Octopus, guys. Some of the stuff in Visual Studio is pretty cool these days, although a little rocky in parts. But I mean, it's just the number of tools out there is amazing. But the one I can recommend right now is Git and GitHub.
Yeah, I definitely second that one. Git I was skeptical at first when I first started using Git, or before I started first using it, like, I don't know, 5 years ago or something, 4 years ago. But I'm totally sold on Git. Git is absolutely awesome. I wouldn't use anything else for source code and so on. The other tool I do really like is GoCD, which is the continuous delivery pipeline visualization and control tool that comes from ThoughtWorks Studios. It's perhaps a bit more of an advanced tool than some of these other tools out there. It can do continuous integration, but it's really there for the visualization and control of deployment pipelines. It's hugely powerful for more complex, more advanced scenarios for teams that have some complicated requirements, multiple components and so on, and being able to provide choices for deployment for teams. So I think I'll put the URL in the little chat window here. Where does it go?
We have 5 minutes before we need to wrap up. So you guys are authoring this new book, Database Lifecycle Management, Achieving Continuous Database Delivery. Could you guys tell us a little bit about this, and is it available, and why should people go read it?
Sure. Yes. So the short answer is yes, people should go read it. You should read it because for several reasons. One, we're pulling together practices which are really still emerging. So you actually have a chance to kind of influence the sort of content and stories and things that we put together in this book. We're doing it in a lean fashion. So we're publishing the book via LeanPub, which is a lean publishing platform, all digital. It produces a PDF or ebook versions. and we're publishing it like a chapter at a time, something like this, or sections at a time. So we're looking for feedback on that. In other words, what we're doing is we're continuously delivering a book that relates to continuous delivery for databases, if that makes sense. Maybe that sounds a bit cheesy, but that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to actually adopt the practices that we're talking about in the book of releasing small chunks regularly. We're trying to do that with the book as well. So it would be interesting to see how the book pans out anyway. But we're pulling together a lot of experience from our own experience, but from some other people too, and trying to give this sort of overview of the breadth and depth of DLM, which so far no one else has done. So we think we're the first people to do it, and that's why partly why we're so excited about it.
And Grant, what is your experience writing this book? I know you've written many books in the past and contributed to books, so how's this one different? And
well, I mean, obviously, the fact that we're trying to do this in an agile, iterative approach is entertaining as an author. Like that Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." Man, this is interesting. But it's going to be good. I mean, because we really are trying to come at it from a different point of view than is traditional, right? It's not simply saying, a developer saying this or a DBA saying this. We're really trying to think of it as, as IT people, right? As members of the organization, and here's what this DLM stuff's going to do for you. It's not a I don't know, I shudder to say this because I'm going to be kind of wrong. It's not a how-to book, right? It's much more of a why thing. And although there's a bunch of how-to stuff in there, so now I'm questioning what I just said.
So with the book, we've got at least three people in mind when we're writing the book. One is DBA. But two is these are equal focus. DBA, developer, but also a kind of technical decision maker. So it could be head of IT, it could be head of software development, it could be CTO, someone like this. So we're trying to write a book which actually has some material in for each of these three different roles, because it needs people in these, at least in these three kind of groups or traditional separate functions to make DLM work. We need some input from developers, need some input from DBAs, need some input from people who can affect change across the organization as well. So it'll be a book which you should be able to give to your boss or should be able to give to someone in the other team, and it'll be useful for them too.
so how can people get the book? What is currently available if you're writing it in this lean style?
Currently, I don't think anything's available.
We've got I think the forward is available at the moment. If you go to you've put the link there, Stephanie, that's cool. So if you go to thedlmbook.com, you'll be able to see what we've been doing there, and we'll be publishing that over the forthcoming months. I think the aim is to have it done by the end of the year, isn't it, Stephanie? I think we'll be done before the end of 2015. So if you can sign up for updates, and part of the great thing about LeanPub is that you can sign up for an update. You can even buy the book, and all future updates are free. That's one of the great things about LeanPub. So you don't need to worry. You just get an email with, hey, you can download the new version. So there's no real problem with buying it early. In fact, you get an advantage for buying it early because you get to support what they do. You get early access to content.
Give feedback to Matthew and Grant to influence the rest of the book and
absolutely.
Review. So we are out of time, but I want to thank Matthew and Grant so much. It's been a really interesting. I'm actually gutted because there are some really good questions coming in now around TFS versus Git and database source control migrations versus state-based. We'll follow up with you guys afterwards and do a blog post about the questions we've got in. If you have any additional questions, please contact us at dlm@redgate.com. There's the link to the book, the dlmbook.com, if you want to check that out. If you have just want to learn more about DLM, we have tons of free articles, webinars, and free trials on our website, redgate.com/products-DLM. We also offer one-day workshop courses in database source control, database continuous integration, and automated database deployment. That's that final link there. And you can always get in touch with us at Redgate on Twitter. So we look forward to hearing you. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in this series next month. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks again, Matthew and Grant.
Thank you.